thank you for your very warm welcome. And can I just start by thanking this university. When I was in the cabinet 5 years, one of the most important things I was doing was trying to create what we called an industrial strategy for the UK. And Warwick, partly through the manufacturing group, partly through Richard Lambert, your Chancellor, and some of the other departmental work, was an absolutely key part of that. So we have a debt to this university. I'm also old enough to remember the time when you opened. It was almost half a century ago. I don't know whether you know the origins of your university, but most of the new universities at that time, like York and Lancaster, got off to a very quiet, smooth start. But your university started amid student protests and riots and boycotts. And interestingly, the reason was that the student body rejected the whole idea of having business studies on the campus. This was contaminating the academic world with international capitalism. And there was a very strong backlash. Anyway, things have obviously changed, but it's interesting to recall where you came from as a university. Well, in terms of what I want to do, I want to talk essentially around this book that I produced, and it's available afterwards, and I'll just say a few words about what I'm trying to achieve. First of all, this is a sequel to a book I wrote at the beginning of the financial crisis back in 2008. I was then a politician in opposition. I'd become increasingly alarmed over the previous years. Everybody was saying everything was wonderful, we were in a perfect world with full employment, very little inflation, the economy was booming along. But it did worry me at the time that we had this extraordinary boom taking place in housing prices, in credit. The banks were behaving increasingly irresponsibly, and I'd become very outspoken on that subject. And I wasn't surprised, though I didn't absolutely predict how it would happen, when we got into this very severe financial crisis. And everybody, academics, practitioners, I think were totally confused, unable to explain what was going on. We've never had a full-blown banking crisis in this country really since the beginning, indeed the earlier part of the 19th century. Economics, as it was taught in universities, didn't really deal with financial crises. So I sat down to write a book to try and teach myself what was going on, and going back to some of the earlier literature that I learned about as a student, people like Hyman Minsky, economic historians like Kindleberger, trying to explain why panics and crashes happened. It's not part of the conventional way of thinking about the world, where your predecessors, I hope you're still not, were being told about efficient financial markets and a sort of permanent sense of equilibrium, and something that clearly had gone very badly wrong. So I wrote a book at that time, and I've now come back to it 7 years later, trying to assess where we got to in the wake of this remarkable economic event, the most dramatic that we've had in our lifetimes. So that's the first point. The second point is it is about economic policy, but it isn't just about economic policy. If you want to read good books about the economics of what's been happening, there are some very well-written, coherent economic literate books written, some of them by commentators, Martin Wolf and Julian Tett, and more recently by Adair Turner, who's former head of the financial regulator, and some by distinguished economists, many of them actually rather critical of the way things have been managed, Stiglitz and Krugman, and Richard Koo, particularly on Japan, Meghnad Desai, and others. So there is a rich literature which has accumulated, and I'm not actually trying to put those guys out of a job. My approach is different. What I'm trying to do is to integrate the world of economics and practical politics, which I've been in both. And the reason I approach it from that direction is that economics and politics do interact in a very powerful way. The coalition government, of which I was part, happened in significant measure because there was a perception of a critical economic crisis in 2010. In normal circumstances, my party might well have walked away from the coalition. We would have been fighting the Conservatives most of our lives. Most of us felt pretty uncomfortable about the whole idea. But there was a sense that this was an economic crisis. Under these conditions, you work in a coalition, and hence you had what you had for 5 years. So the politics of the economic policy in the last 5 years is very important to understand. I think it's also important in a deeper sense, which I try to explain in this book, that I think in some subtle ways the nature of politics has changed. It's led to the emergence of what I've called the politics of identity. If you think about the things which currently get people really going in the UK at the moment, it's about, well, recently about the future of the UK, nationalism in Scotland, about our future in the European Union, our identity as a nation. It's about immigration, religion, all issues to do with identity, rather than the traditional kind of left-right spectrum. But of course that argument goes on, and if you look at Germany, if you look at France, if you look at the issues being stirred up by Trump and Councillor Cruz in the United States, it is a new kind of politics based very much around identity, nationalism, religion, and issues of that kind. And I think there is a link with the crisis in the sense that what has happened is we've had an upsurge of anxiety, fear. People, for the first time in half a century, have seen their living standards seriously decline. And it's prompted a much more aggressive and insecure form of politics. Of course, it's more complex than that, but I think there is a link. And what I do try in this book is to explore some of those relationships. I think the third point I would make is that, partly because of my experience in government, I am writing about the UK and what we've done and what I think we should be doing to have sensible policies here. But it's always worth reminding ourselves that the UK, it's, well, 1% of the world population, 2% of global GDP on a purchasing power parity basis. You know, we're a small country in a global sense, and massively influenced by events elsewhere. And maybe it's worth putting in context some of the massive things that have happened in the world economy, and happened with remarkable speed. And maybe I could just start with this. Sorry, progressing too fast. Can you take me back to the first one? Back. There we are, yeah. This is the sort of economic history of the world on one chart. That's slightly pretentious. But it reminds us about what happened 2 centuries ago. The world economy was dominated by China, India, to the extent to which it was possible to judge these things. There's a wonderful piece of work done by a man called Angus Maddison of the OECD in Paris, who has been compiling economic statistics going actually back 20 centuries, but certainly within the last 2 centuries, and that's what the world looked like at that time. Of course, if you progress through the age of British Industrial Revolution, the age of imperialism and so on, of course, Europe dominated the world economy, the United States coming up fast, and then after the Second World War, of course, we had the one superpower, not just military but economic. And then when we look at the world today, You're almost going back to where we were 2 centuries ago. The United States, of course, just about, depending on how you measure it, the world's biggest economy, but China probably comparable on some measures, slightly bigger, some slightly smaller, and India probably now, certainly on a purchasing power parity basis, the 3rd economy, certainly roughly comparable to Japan, depending on how you look at the exchange rates and so on. But that is the new world. And what happens, therefore, particularly right at this very moment in China, where massive uncertainty, has enormous implications on us. And although I have my reservations about why Mr. Osborne made his speech last week, and if you're rather cynical, you could say the guy's making his excuses for what might happen during the course of the year, he's absolutely right to point out that we are an open economy, and that things that could go wrong in the Eurozone, and more particularly in China, will have an enormous impact on what happens here during this year and after. But let me just go back to the economic crisis and its aftermath. And there are a lot of complex interacting forces here. But let me just start with one very basic point. Sorry, that's it. I think there's a reasonable consensus amongst those people who have interpreted the crisis and its aftermath, who have focused on the growth of debt as an absolutely central factor. And you'll know from your economic theory, going back to Whitesell and others, debt and Irving Fisher, debt and deflation, that an accumulation of debt in an economy has significant economic impacts. And what happened in the run-up to the crisis, as you see, was a very considerable increase in aggregate debt. And when I talk about aggregate debt, I'm talking about private households and governments and the corporate sector. I'm not including here banks. There was an enormous amount of leverage in the banks. I'll come back to that later. But if we're talking about more conventional forms of debt, there was this very, very big increase in debt. And crucially, it hasn't gone down. Since the crisis began, 2008, 2009, in developed countries, including ours, aggregate debt has risen or remained roughly the same in nominal terms. Household debt may have gone down a bit, government debt's gone up, but in aggregate terms, debt has remained very substantial. And it's been the worry about what that can do to conventional economies, which has very heavily determined the policy response. The major worry after 2008 was that this big overhang of debt would lead to substantial deleveraging by households and by companies, and that in turn would drag the economy into depression, deflation, negative inflation, and we had something of a rehearsal of how this could play out in Japan, which had an earlier financial crisis built very heavily on exploding debt, government and private and corporate together, and which did produce a prolonged period of stagnation, still going on today, and this worry about deflation. And for those of you who are not economists, it's not obvious why falling prices are a bad thing. I mean, from a common sense point of view, it sounds great, falling prices, everything getting cheaper. But of course, if prices fall on a systematic basis, what happens is that people no longer buy stuff. They're waiting for things to get cheaper, and as a result, the demand falls, unemployment rises, and so on. And companies, seeing their prices fall, are making losses, stopping investment, grinding to a halt. So from a big macro point of view, deflation is a thoroughly dangerous thing. And settled in the minds of the policymakers after 2008 was how to stop this taking hold. And the standard mechanism that was adopted by the United States and Britain and Japan and latterly the European countries was to adopt a policy of ultra-cheap money. And there were other things happening at the same time. There was a temporary deficits on budgets, sort of Keynesian type stimulus, but the key response has been ultra-cheap money. All the major governments of the world that mattered went for effectively zero interest rates. And remarkably, and this is what's strange and also very worrying about where we are at the moment, 7 years on, we're still there. You will have all followed a couple of weeks ago, the Americans made the first very, very tentative move to start increasing official interest rates again, short-term interest rates. But the world, including Britain, is still pretty much at rock bottom. Some European countries even have negative interest rates. You have to pay for the privilege of putting your money in a bank. And this is also true of long-term interest rates, what governments have been doing in coordination with their central banks is buying up vast quantities of government securities, gilts, driving up the price, driving down the yield, therefore long-term interest rates, the objective of policy. And there is a brilliant paper which some of you may have read, and all of you should try to read, by a man called Andrew Haldane, who is a senior figure in the Bank of England, on historical interest rates. And he goes back over the centuries and comes to the conclusion that we now have the lowest interest rates in history since the days of the Babylonians. You know, a strange consequence of this very, very aggressive, ultra-cheap monetary policy, and which has all kind of consequences. That there is capital is being allocated in a very strange way, and more to the point, we're stuck in a position where economies are still not significantly reviving. I mean, the American economy is doing reasonably well, 2% growth, Britain about the same, but senior Americans, people like Larry Summers, you may have read his stuff, arguing that even the United States, for all its dynamism and all its recovery, is stuck in what they call the form of stagnation, structural stagnation. And in the Eurozone and Japan, very firmly stuck in negative territory and no immediate prospect of moving out of this trap where you have the hangover of debt, ultra low money. So that's one of the legacies of the crises that we're still grappling with, and I'll come back to this later, but this curve here now also applies to China. Piled up an enormous amount of corporate debt in order to keep its economy going in the last 7 years. It's been the miracle of the world economy that the Chinese have grown so rapidly, sucked goods into China, helped support commodity prices, and all that is now being questioned because they've acquired a curve a little bit like that. So that's one of the first of the legacies. Let me deal now with the second, which is to do with the banking system. One of the questions which people like myself, who were a bit critical of what was happening in the UK a decade ago, was that, of course, Britain has a much bigger banking system relative to its economy than almost any other Western country. It's very striking if you see that chart that although Britain and the United States were at the centre of the banking collapse, in terms of its importance in the economy, Britain has a much more bank-dependent economy. And that's why when the initial crash hit us, Britain was much more effective. We're up there with Switzerland and Ireland and even the Luxembourgs and Icelands of this world are not much more bank-dependent than we are. The UK was in a particularly exposed position because it wasn't just that Britain was very bank dependent, but that our mainstream banks, basically Barclays, HSBC, RBS, and Lloyd's, each of them had a balance sheet roughly comparable to or bigger than the British economy. I know you're combining stocks and flows, and the economists will say that's cheating a bit, but nonetheless it gives you some measure of their size. So when one of them went down, which was RBS, Lloyd's also did in a slightly different way, and Barclays virtually collapsed, but was rescued, I think, by the Emir of Qatar. The shock to the British economy was massive, and 7 years on, again, we're still dealing with the consequences of it, because in order to stabilise, the banks drastically reduced lending, particularly lending to business that was seen as high risk, and the traditional problems that British business had of accessing credit became acute. I spent much of my 5 years in government trying to deal with the consequences of that problem, of small companies, startups, builders trying to build houses, couldn't get credit to do it. And I set up a couple of state banks, one of them called the British Business Bank, to try and deal with that problem. But it remains a fundamental difficulty. A very bank-dependent economy subject to a crash with knock-on consequences for the economy. Now, of course, the banks are much safer. They require to hold more capital. One of the big reforms which I put through with George Osborne was actually to split the big universal banks in the UK. We call it ring fencing between what we call the casinos, the investment banks and the retail banks. That's now gone through Parliament, quite a radical reform. And so the banks are safer, but many of the problems associated with the bank collapse are still with us. And if you look at this in a slightly bigger context, sorry, can you go back again? It's sensitive. You can see that what's happening in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, and this is a little bit old, I haven't got anything beyond 2012, is that some of the biggest banks in the world, including HSBC and Barclays, which are British, have actually got bigger since the crisis, not smaller. And we're therefore left with the problem about what happens if these banks fail. In 2008, 2009, they were dependent on the British taxpayer coming in and bailing them out and stopping the whole system collapsing. But now they're even bigger. So we haven't solved that problem. One of the ideas which regulators have had was making banks sign what were called living wills, so that if they collapse, there is a mechanism for dealing with it that doesn't involve nationalisation. That process is still very, very undeveloped. So a key point I want to leave with you is that we've had the banking crisis, many of the legacies are still there, many of the problems are still there, and the whole idea that you can't have another financial crisis, I would say, is a myth. I mean, it won't happen in the same way, but there are many elements of instability still in the system. So those are two of the legacies, the legacy of debt and the monetary policy that flowed from it, and then you have the banking system and what remains of its problems. Now, a third legacy is in relation to government finance. And much of the debate around so-called austerity has come from the fact that in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, the British government, like other Western governments, spent very heavily on a very large deficit, temporary deficit. Government revenues fell in the crisis, government spending rose, helping people out of work and so on. So you've got very big temporary deficits which added to government debt, together with obligations that were taken on trying to defend the banking system. Now, because of the kind of obsession, and I use the word reservedly, about government debt and deficits, it is worth to start by putting it into some sort of context. And as you can see from the end of the chart, debt to GDP is starting to rise quite substantially, but historically the amount of public debt, government debt in the economy, has been before much higher. Of course, during the Second World War, Britain borrowed unlimited. You don't stop the troops fighting because the government's running out of money. You borrow. You borrow, you borrow, you borrow, and you just keep going, and you deal with the problem afterwards, which is essentially what happened. In the interwar period, public debt rose very, very substantially. And even if you go back to the middle of the 19th century, when Britain was supposedly doing brilliantly well, running an empire and running half the world, government debt was far higher than it is today, far higher. So what was the problem? Why has there been so much preoccupation with the issue of austerity? Well, the argument was advanced back in 2010, and we had this presented to us by key officials in the British government using economic literature. You've probably come across the articles of Rogoff and Reinhardt, the so-called cliff edge theory, that if government debt gets much beyond 80–90% of GDP, you can be plunged into a very serious economic crisis. And that was used by the Treasury to argue that we should deal with this in a tough way, through austerity. I would argue that up to a point that was necessary. We had what economists call a structural deficit. In other words, it was a deficit that wasn't going to go away with recovery because revenues had been permanently lost from the banking system, for example. So we had to deal with that problem. My disagreement with my colleagues in government was that austerity extended to fairly drastic cuts in public investment at a time when capital was extraordinarily cheap. And in fact, we had a running battle in government, which has continued now, as to why on earth the British government doesn't go out and borrow to invest in railways and public housing and all of these things. But the reason was this preoccupation with public debt. Now, there is another angle to this, which is historical. And I've acquired a slightly peculiar reputation in recent months by coming to the defence of the Labour opposition. Because a story has built up from my Conservative former colleagues that in the run-up to the economic crisis, the then Labour government, Brown and company, let the public finances get completely out of control. Well, I believe, and I argued at the time, that the Brown government made some very serious errors. They ignored the housing bubble, they ignored the way the banks were behaving. What they didn't do was to mismanage the public finances, because as you see, running up to the financial crisis, public sector net debt, it was rising slightly. It was going in the wrong direction, if you like, but there was no great travesty of mismanagement. Of course, subsequently, it's risen very strongly, and it was absolutely right that the government in 2000 and 2009 allowed public debt to rise, because that was the consequence of the falling of, had they not done so, we'd have been plunged into an even deeper recession. But the big issue now, the big policy question, is now that public debt has roughly stabilised, about 80% of GDP, should the priority now be to reduce it, or should it be, as I believe, to take advantage of very cheap capital to invest in the future? And that would, of course, raise debt temporarily, but in the long run, you generate an income flow to neutralise it. It's a very big open question now in economic policy, and I'm interested to hear your collective views about it. The fourth and final legacy is this one. What's happened in the build-up to the economic crisis, as you see, going through the 1990s, was an enormous increase in the price of housing relative to people's income. A housing boom, sometimes people use the word bubble, that has a technical meaning, but anyway, it was very highly inflated. This chart only goes up to 2013, but if you traced it to 2015, you would find that that chart has now probably gone to a new peak. And the figures are in many ways very alarming, because across the country as a whole, you now have a relationship between the price of housing and average and median earnings of about 6. In London, it's double digits, 15, 20, parts of London. Oxford, Cambridge, it's the same. I don't know what position is around here. But way, way, way beyond the capacity of people on average earnings to purchase property or even to rent in many parts of the country. And this is having enormously destabilizing economic and political and social consequences, particularly for young people. I don't know how many people here are thinking about buying property, but unless you've got rich parents, forget it. It just isn't feasible unless you've got a very high income. And this whole process of the escalation of house prices was a key feature of the run-up to the crisis. Now, what is interesting about the UK is that whereas in the United States and Spain and Ireland, which also had housing bubbles, financed by the banks, financed by excessive credit, those prices have come right back down again to something that's like a historic normal. In Britain, they haven't. And we've had a very alarming set of developments in the UK, and Professor Kratz, who's in the front row and who's written very eloquently on the influence of housing in economic policy over the years, and particularly what happened in the interwar period when the recession was followed by a big spurt of house building. What happened in the UK after the crash was that house prices basically remained very, very high, despite the fact that demand was much weaker. Essentially what happened in 2008, 2009, 2010 was that production crashed, fell through the floor. And the numbers are quite extraordinary. If you go back to the peak, back in 1970, I was at that point a city council in Glasgow, building lots of these high-rise flats, some of which have had to be knocked down because they're not very good quality, but anyway, we built lots of them. Vast numbers of houses were being built. Now we're down to just over 100,000 a year, a quarter of the peak. And this is for a British population that is much larger because of net immigration and other demographic trends. This is, of course, reflected in prices and affordability. Why did production crash? Mixture of reasons. Builders couldn't get credit, lack of skills. Lots of bricklayers just disappeared from the labour market in the recession, having come back, having to be brought in from abroad. Planning problems, complex issues. But if you're asking me what was now the most serious policy problem in the UK and the most egregious failure of government policy, it's here. It's the inability to maintain housing supply at anything remotely like proper levels of expected outcome. And the effects of this, as I say, on prices, affordability, on social mobility, on the younger generation are absolutely profound. So those are four of the legacies of the crisis. I just want to try and run things up reasonably soon to give you a chance to ask questions. One of the things I do in the book is to ask the question, well, what will you do about it? I mean, I was a policymaker, I was in the government, I have some responsibility for all of this, and I'm now thinking about how you make things better. Apart from the particular issues around banking and housing, I think the one crying need, which we did try to address in government, was to rebalance the UK economy. Because what's happened in recent years, we have got a recovery. It is real, 2% growth, better than almost any other Western country. The employment position is spectacularly good. More people in Britain in work than anybody can ever remember. Unemployment is relatively low. I mean, on the surface, this is a highly successful, but it is terribly unbalanced. We still have this very high dependence on the banking sector and finance in general, still have a very distorted and unsatisfactory property sector with high levels of inflation, and we still have export industries, whether it's manufacturing or creative industries, which are weak and are underperforming. I tried to address that in government through an industrial strategy, trying to build up proper flows of credit to small companies in those industries, trying to address the skill problem through advanced apprenticeships particularly, trying to work with the car industry, the aerospace industry with long-term development projects, trying to set up centres to promote innovation, which Britain is rather bad, as opposed to science, at which we're very good. All of those things, but this is a 25-year project. And I do worry that since May, a lot of the interest in all of that has started to ebb away. Anyway, let me just finish as I started by bringing us back to the big global picture. This chart, which I got from the International Monetary Fund, tries to describe how much of global growth has come either from developed countries, which are on the right, or from the emerging markets, which are on the left. Now, the one at the bottom is a slightly funny one because it is an IMF projection until 2017 about what they think will happen, and that probably will not now happen because some of the emerging markets like China are in some trouble. But the key point about all of this is that, as you see, much of the growth in the world economy, particularly in the last decade and a half, has been driven by the emerging markets and not by the developed world. As long as we can remember, it was, if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold. That's still partly true. But much of the growth and negative growth now depends on China, other emerging markets, particularly India, actually, which is growing spectacularly well, given its history, and given its increasingly important size. And the big issue for this year, and indeed for the next few months, is really what happens to that bottom segment. Will the Chinese growth actually materialise or not? I mean, what's happened in China, as you all know the story in broad terms, is that since Deng Xiaoping took over in China in the wake of the end of the Maoist era, China was opened up, market reforms, unbelievably successful, spectacular growth, never before seen in human history, really, except in some relatively small countries like Korea. A country that had been mired in economic backwardness for centuries, emerging as a very, very successful middle-income country, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, and particularly since 2008-2009, when the Chinese were worried stiff that they would be dragged down into this world recession, they launched an extraordinary boom in construction and infrastructure. I think this factoid that I think Krugman has mentioned, that in the 4 years after 2009, the Chinese poured more cement than the United States has poured in the last century. A phenomenal investment boom. Now, of course, one of the consequences of that is that the Chinese economy has now got out of kilter. Too much investment, too much emphasis on exports, too little emphasis on services, and they're unbalanced in the opposite way from the UK. And they're trying to rebalance very, very quickly without throwing this remarkable growth story into chaos and failure. Massive challenge, one of the biggest policy challenges that has ever been faced. And as part of this slowdown that's now happening, they've got that 14% official growth, it was probably a bit less than that, to 6 or 7%. Nobody quite knows now what's happening in China. There is an enormous amount of unofficial credit, so-called shadow banking, which is now going bust. A lot of Chinese companies didn't go to the banks, they went to the local council, they had friends, lent them some money. All of that credit is now put in some jeopardy. None of us know whether the Chinese are going to manage this very difficult transition. I'm having met the guys, dealt with them, and these are very able people, communists in theory, but not in practice. I think they probably have the technical nous to be able to navigate it, but that is just guesswork. But if they fail, and we have a very, very serious slowdown in China, combined with continued stagnation in Europe and in Japan, and weak recovery in the United States, the prospects for the next year or so are not at all rosy. So on that totally cheerful note, I'll leave you to ask me questions. Thank you.
To the people for sharing your thoughts and views on this topic. I'm sure there'll be many questions, so without further ado, if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll start.
I would like to say thank you for the great speech. You're a very inspiring character, and I would just like to ask, the financial crisis was the worst we had since the Great Depression, and then we had the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1933 that kind of tried to prevent that happening again. And if I'm not mistaken, the act you're proposing and you've been very passionate about is very similar to the Glass-Steagall Act. So I would just like to ask your opinion. In your opinion, if it hadn't been repealed, would the magnitude of the crisis that happened, would it have been less if the 1999 repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act didn't happen? And do you think that the act you're proposing, if it was proposed in America, would prevent a similar crisis happening, a crisis happening in a similar way?
Well, I think the honest answer is that this issue of the universal banks and whether they should be split up as the Glass-Steagall provisions required in America, and subsequently repealed, as you know, by the Clinton administration. I think it's important but not crucial, within my judgment. I mean, the financial institution whose collapse brought the system down was Lehman Brothers. It was a very big investment bank that was stuffed with all these extremely complex derivatives that the bankers didn't understand. But it wasn't a universal bank. It was a standalone investment bank. It is certainly true that RBS in the UK and Barclays were both universal banks, and the argument some of us put forward was that the monkey business that was going on in the investment banks could have cross-contaminated traditional banking. In fact, it probably wasn't central to the crisis. There are the cultural issues that arise as a result of investment bankers running your high street banks are very serious. And the fact that people like Bob Diamond were running Barclays was equally unhelpful, really, for the culture of British business finance. But I think the simple answer to your question is I think it was important, but not absolutely central to the crisis.
Should we take some more questions?
Thank you for that talk. I was just wondering whether I could pick up on some of the things you said about sort of diversification in the British economy, and this idea that we need more manufacturing and we need less banking. Given that we're in a world where we have the UK has, broadly speaking, a decreasing population in terms of the number of workers coming in compared to previous generations, where there are far larger workforces in other countries, and therefore capital-intensive work is probably more effective and more able to be done in the UK compared to other countries. And actually a lot of the fastest growing countries in the world are countries that are diversified. Why is there this sort of political obsession with talking about growing manufacturing, when in fact we could be doing far more successfully by focusing on the things that the UK economy over the last 20 and 30 years has been very effective at doing compared to other countries around the world?
Well, I don't think manufacturing is some kind of panacea. I mean, it's 10% of the British economy and declining. But it is important, and it's disproportionately important, because something of the order of 75% of the output is exported. Something like that. It also has a high import content. If you go to Jaguar Land Rover, most of its stuff is exported, but a lot of their components are imported. So it's highly tradable, and therefore crucial to maintaining external balance, at least in terms of trade. It's also important because the manufacturing sector, more than any other, does hardcore R&D, research and development, which drives productivity, and it's productivity growth that drives living standards. And one of the failures of the British economy in the last few years is that we've had a stagnation of productivity. People have been found work, but it is unproductive or relatively unproductive work. And the manufacturing sector, again, disproportionately provides high productivity and job. So that's why it is important, and it's more important than the nominal figure of 10% of the economy. So I don't apologise for having spent quite a lot of my time in government trying to encourage and support long-term investments in British manufacturing. But one shouldn't be completely monopolised by it. The creative industries, which are, cultural industries, IT-based, and this is coming out very rapidly. There's a lot of intellectual property in there, a lot of highly productive work, design. This is all important too. So I would qualify my argument slightly to say that what we should be really trying to work on are what I would call tradables. Tradable goods and tradable services, and of course the manufacturing is the tradable good business.
We can take a few more questions. In the middle here.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. Really enjoyed the content. So you mentioned that house prices have been rising since the financial crisis, and what my question is, do you think that the Bank of England should be thinking about raising interest rates, given that the Federal Reserve has already raised interest rates just last month? And if the Bank of England should raise interest rates, what do you think the effect would be in the UK economy, given that George Osborne mentioned that there was a cocktail of economic risks posed to the UK economy?
Well, they're clearly terrified of doing it. We've now been waiting 3 years. I think Governor Carney started hinting that interest rates would go up, and it repeatedly hasn't happened. They've been partly waiting for the Federal Reserve in the US. But even then, we're being warned that it's not going to happen in the UK. It's an interesting question as to why there is so much nervousness. And I think it's partly the fear of failure. Several countries did raise interest rates prematurely. The Swedes pushed up interest rates in 2012 and promptly slumped back into recession. Nobody wants to repeat that story. And that's why everybody's nervously watching what happens in the United States. So I think that's one reason. The other, which is implied in your question, is that there is a cocktail of nasty things going on out there. And confidence in the business sector is actually quite brittle. Most forward-looking indicators of business confidence are not good at the moment. Consumer confidence is high, but not business confidence. And in that kind of context, they're desperately anxious to avoid making a mistake. I think the final point I would make is this, that Osborne is committed to quite significant fiscal tightening. That was the consequence of Conservative government and the new public spending review that was announced in November. This has all got lost in these big arguments in the Labour Party, but actually what's happened was that the current government has roughly doubled the scale of the fiscal tightening from what we've agreed in the coalition. And if you're doing serious fiscal tightening at a time when the world economy is in difficult circumstances, the last thing you want to be doing is giving another squeeze to the economy and higher interest rates. And then my own instincts would be that we should be probably trying to move to normal monetary conditions as soon as possible, but offsetting that by a fiscal policy that is more relaxed and allows significantly more public investment and borrowing for public investment. So, Professor, front row.
If you're a private company and you had too much debt and one of your creditors took you to court, the judge would probably recommend a debt equity swap. That's to say, replacing the debt with equity. Now, the two countries in the world that have done this on a fairly big scale, unfortunately, are Argentina and Greece. Isn't it time they got some serious company by countries like us issuing that kind of debt, where people can buy a share in the growth of the economy, as someone like Schiller has recommended, in which case a lot of what you've outlined as a problem would effectively disappear.
Yes, it's difficult to apply corporate financing to national economies, and the sovereign debt has different status, as you know. And the principle is right. I mean, as it happens, before I became an MP, I worked for Shell, a big oil company, chief economist for a while. And their philosophy was very much based on the group's finances should rest on equity rather than debt. It was one of the lowest gearing of any big company, and is much healthier as a consequence. And if you could apply that to sovereign debt, or quasi-sovereign debt, of which there's a lot around at the moment, as you know, government or corporate bonds that are guaranteed by governments, then that would help considerably with any threat to national solvency. I think there are basically two things we ought to be looking at, one of which is exactly what you described, and the other, more brutally, is actually writing off quite a lot of debt. I mean, I think the great failure in the Greek crisis, we understand how it happened, but was that the deal which could have been struck with Greece, which is that the Greeks observed fairly strict conditionality of good policy in return for having their debt relieved, that never happened. The debt is still there, and the problem will have to be visited at another time. But I think where you are right is that dealing with debt in a more creative way, rather than just letting it sit there as a kind of overhang, is deeply unhealthy, and we've got to be more imaginative how we do it.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the question and answer session there. On a final note, on behalf of the Summit team, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and in particular, I'd like to thank the Warwick Policy Lab for collaborating with us for this event. The internal ticket sales for the Summit will take place on Wednesday the 20th of January, which is next week. Last year we sold out internal tickets in 2 minutes, so make sure that you're on your laptops when the sale goes live. And also finally, if you'd like a copy of Sir Cable's book, if you could please leave by this entrance on this side. Thank you very much.